Hey everybody, welcome back to Chapter 13, Political Transformations, and the study of Section 3, The Steppes in Siberia, the Making of a Russian Empire. And, I listened to the first two sections. I normally do, after I do these recordings of video slides for you guys, and I realized that there was a lot of rustling around noise and outside noise, so hopefully I'll get that a little bit better for the rest of this chapter and, the rest of the video slides that I make for you. Okay, let's get started with the steppes in Siberia and how the Russians made an empire. We won't just look at this, we'll also look at the Mughal and Ottoman empires in Section 4 as well, the next video slide. And as we cover these different empires, it would be a good idea to start taking this opportunity to compare and contrast these empires, whether it has to do with religion, economics, their different expansion policies. It's a good idea to cover or to compare and contrast some of that. And, we'll also cover the span of Russian history in this section as well. And it wouldn't be a bad idea to compare the Russian territorial expansion to the expansion of the European colonies in the Americas, because they are quite different. Okay, so let's get started. All right, the steppes in Siberia, the making of a Russian empire. So a small Russian state centered on Moscow began to emerge around 1500. Moscow began to conquer most of their neighboring cities, and over 3 centuries it grew into a massive empire. And their early expansion was at first into the grasslands to the south and the east, and this was for security against those nomads. And eventually they expanded into Siberia, and this was a matter of opportunity, especially with furs, as opposed to securing a threat. Experiencing the Russian Empire. Now, conquest was made possible by modern weapons and organization, and as they conquered many of their neighboring cities, they brought devastating epidemics, especially in the remote areas of Siberia. The locals there had no immunity to smallpox and measles, and so those had devastating effects on the native populations there. There's a lot of pressure to convert to Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, and so the Russians, this was, as they expanded into these different areas, this was a large-scale settlement policy of these Russians into these new lands. And they eventually outnumbered the native population, especially in Siberia. Now, they discouraged pastoralism and tried to Russify many of the natives. Kind of like the idea of Americanization, many natives became Russified. And they demanded, along with these conquests, the Russians demanded yasek from especially the Siberian natives. After the Russian state used its military to conquer an area, the local population would be forced to pay yasek, or tribute. And in Siberia, this was usually in the form of furs, or what was called, quote, soft gold. And that was the region's main export at the time. And this shows you an excellent map of where the Russians expanded and around what time periods. Of course, you can see Moscow, this area of Muscovy right here, in 1462, expanding to the south and to the east, and eventually up here in the north. Some of these cities had not been established yet, but they're on this map to give you an idea of relative location. And then you can see they expand even more to the south and to the east. Especially, right, you can see into the Ukraine. Here's the Black Sea, right? The rest of Europe is over here. And all the way into Siberia. And eventually, by 1800, they had conquered this huge, massive amount of land. And even here, this was Russian-occupied territory, even though it wasn't necessarily considered part of the Russian Empire, but definitely occupied by the Russians. All right, Russians and empire. With imperial expansion, the Russians became a smaller proportion of the overall population. Even though they outnumbered most of the natives in certain areas, they really became a smaller proportion of the entire overall population. They had rich agricultural lands, especially in the south, right where the Ukraine is, and in those grasslands, furs, minerals, and that helped to make Russia a great power by the 18th century. And it wasn't just an Asian power, but they became a very strong European power as well. With all of their conquering and their military policies enforced on their neighbors and their expansion policies, Russia became pretty multi-ethnic. They conquered a variety of peoples in the west, and the south, and the east, and Russia had numerous different ethnicities and religions within its holdings. And the empire brought in great wealth, especially from those furs, to the agricultural produce, like I said, in those rich agricultural lands, to trade with the Far East, to trade with China. But the Russians have essentially always had a long-term identity problem, a Russian identity problem. Expansion made Russia a very militarized state, and that just became ingrained. And this really reinforced autocracy, or absolute power by the leader. And a great example of that is Peter the Great, who ruled from 1689 to 1725. Just like it sounds, Peter the Great. And in the West, Russia competed with other states and empires. When I say West, we're talking about Europe for them, and annexed lands as far west as Poland, and in the southern parts of the Ottoman Empire. And despite numerous victories, the contact with the West showed some of Russia's backwardness. And so Tsar Peter the Great decided they had to reform Russia and pull it into the future. And thus he adopted what he called the process of Westernization, including shaving their beards, building ships in the Baltic, and basically Europe and becoming more European, even though they were already a strong Asian and European power. But Peter the Great is a great example of an autocratic ruler. He had total and absolute solid soul power. And the colonization experience was different for the Russians than it was for the other Europeans in the Americas. The conquest of territories with which Russia had long interacted. Of course, when the Europeans came to the Americas, this is completely brand new world. They'd never had any previous contact. But the Russians had, the territories that they conquered, they'd always had some type of interaction with them. And so that's a big difference between the two. And the conquest took place at the same time as the development of the Russian state. Most of the Europeans were well-established monarchies when they began to explore during that age of exploration, going into the Indian Ocean and then eventually discovering the Americas. Their their empires and their kingdoms were well established. But the conquest for the Russians, that took time, or took place at the same time as, that Russian state was developing. And that's part of that identity crisis, right? Because that expansion made them a very militarized state. And that just stuck with them because that was at the same time that they were developing. And the Russian Empire essentially remained intact until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. And they'd always had contact with China and with Islam because of the Ottoman Empire and some of the other Central Asians that had converted, especially that in the, probably other Central Asians, like maybe in the Persian Empire. But, even though they were a European power, Russia was also an Asian empire. And like I said, they had contact with China, trade especially, and then even a strong increasing Muslim population within Russia. And so the question is, what kind of an empire was Russia? It wasn't an overseas empire like Britain or Spain or Portugal, but Russia had built a massive collection of territories by conquering its neighbors. And this was done by force, and this required Russia to be a fairly authoritarian in its state system. And that's also what's part of its identity crisis, because of that reinforcement of autocracy. And that is the end of Section 3. I'll see you guys for Section 4, Asian Empires.